welcome everybody to the TerreWEB seminar series. This is the fifth in our seminar series where we're talking about communication of science, and we're specifically focusing on global change issues, but really these communication of science cuts across many, many aspects of science, not just global change. From my own experience, I've worked in industry, I've worked in government, now I've worked in academia, and I've experienced myself really high levels of frustration over this translation of science into policy and then getting it across to the public through the media. And I think we as scientists have always kind of relied on other people to communicate our science. And I think that the state of the environment right now is a little bit of a testimony as to how effective that really is. It's not that effective. And so what we want to do in TerreWEB is try and elevate the discussion about communication of us as professors and of our graduate students so that we're better trained and we're better equipped and we feel more motivated to communicate our science to the public and other people like policymakers. So it can only make things better. So that's what this seminar series is about. We've had a number of lectures or seminars on things ranging from just global change to water issues to agricultural issues, and we've got lots of really good seminars coming up. Before I introduce Nicholas, who is our speaker today, I just wanted to also mention that after this, there's, so next month, first I guess I'll mention, next week we have a reading break. The following week we come back and we have another seminar series, seminar on March the 1st by Bob Evans, and he's going to be talking about our energy future, can we make it more sustainable? So really trying to get at some of the ways that we can address the problem of sustainability and how this juxtaposes with energy and sustainability. Okay, so also following this is the 3-minute thesis competition. So for those of you who have a chance, the TerreWEB, which we're part of, TerreWEB has its own heat for the 3-minute thesis. And so we have a number of our graduate students, some of them who are here, who are competing in the 3-minute thesis. And so the idea is that they're supposed to summarize their master's or their doctoral thesis in 3 minutes, and it's a competition. And it's taking place at 2:30 in the Angus building in the Sauder School of Business, room 254. So it'd be great if you could come. Okay, so Nicholas. So we're very pleased today to have Nicholas. You all know Nicholas Coops. He's a professor here in Faculty of Forestry in the Department of Forest Resources Management. He's also a CRC, or Canada Research Chair in Remote Sensing. He has a prolific group of students and a prolific research program where he uses and develops satellite imagery technology for looking at a range of issues, including climate change effects on ecosystems and species distributions, carbon budgets. He looks at land use pattern changes on a number of forestry attributes, including things like wildlife movement, disturbances such as fire and insects. He's published prolifically on all of these things. So today we're really pleased to have him come and talk to us about the use of remote sensing for communicating how forests change and how this can be used to address some of the issues regarding climate change. So I think I won't say anything more, but leave it up to you, Nicholas, to tell us what it's all about. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So, welcome everyone. I am a relatively informal person, so you are welcome to ask questions as we go. This is supposed to be a learning experience for both of us, so I really value hearing your opinion as we go along. So if there are questions or clarifications, please just let me know. I want to cover a little bit at the beginning the science behind why remote sensing is a tool that we use in our assessment for changes in vegetation and changes in the Earth's surface in response to climate or in response to changes in disturbance. So remote sensing is more than pretty pictures, so I hope in the first 20 minutes I give you a crash course in remote sensing and why imagery from satellites and radiometers and aircraft is really useful in our understanding of the terrestrial ecosystem. So I want to start with that, and then I do want to move into highlighting a few projects that we have, which is my lab's sort of work around trying to make this information more publicly accessible. And as I said, I welcome comments and questions as we go. So, I get sick of people just showing remote sensing images when they talk about remote sensing. It's a fundamental important science. So obviously we're trying to explain radiation theory, and we're trying to explain in great depth orbital mechanics. So what I want to do is start to go through this equation with you, work through some of the symbols, and just give you a much more thorough understanding of why remote sensing works the way it does.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
A steak on the bottom line.
I said sufficiently small. I didn't mean completely small. So, but of course, we're not here to see that. We're all here to see this. A magnificent movie of the launch of RadarSat-2. RadarSat-2 is the Canadian remote sensing satellite, specifically built and designed to look at ice. So, whilst I don't have much experience in the use of RadarSat-2, UBC does. Professor Ian Cummings, who's now retired, was in electrical engineering, and he did a lot of the work on the processing of RadarSat as it was launched, and the imagery that we still get from RadarSat today. This is launched from Kazakhstan. People say, why? Do the Canadians hate the Americans that much that we wouldn't use an American rocket to launch the thing in? It turns out that all of the rockets available from the US at the time were too shaky. They were all designed for delivery to the space station, and they weren't really designed for sensitive satellite payloads. This Russian satellite, Russian rocket, I'm sure you noticed, was built for comfort. And it's the one that they put the Russians up into space with, so it's a human rocket, and so that's why they put RadarSat on that one. So the shaking of the satellite was minimized as it went up, and it's worked perfectly ever since. For those of you interested in remote sensing and interested in the geopolitics of remote sensing, you'll also would have seen this article. So this was in 2008. MDA, based in Richmond, were the people who built RadarSat. And they built up a very large community of researchers and scientists who built the satellite and launched it. MDA, the parent company, decided they would sell the arm that built RadarSat. And so they put it out for tender, and it was bidded by an American arms manufacturer who made most of their money through landmines. There was a bit of discussion, as you can imagine, that got louder and louder and louder about whether Canada should be selling the operation of its satellite to another sovereign country. And given that RadarSat is all designed about ice and snow and passage of ships through the Arctic, in the end there was so much concern about a loss of sovereignty that the Canadian government blocked it. It was the first time that the Canadian government had blocked the sale of a Canadian company to another company that was not Canadian. And so RadarSat has remained in Canadian hands and remains owned by MDA. I think it's a very interesting geopolitical debate about remote sensing, and I think demonstrates how important people are now realizing information about their own country and how their own country is changing. In Australia, we've been trying to have a remote sensing satellite for years, but the little cake drives we've been having hasn't raised enough money yet, but we'll get there. But a lot of the argument in Australia is, can we trust other countries to provide us with imagery in times of strife? And there's concern that that may not be true. So I think it's an interesting idea that countries feel that there's a sovereign ownership around the satellite data that they have. There's an also interesting debate about how sustainable it is, and I will touch on that at the very end of the talk. So I do want to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of theory, because how do we get from that beautiful rocket to this fairly stunning animation, I guess, of the processes that go on in the Earth? This is actually a number of satellite images that have all been merged together to make this animation. We're getting key information about vegetation and how that's changing. We're also getting key information about, there was a lot night and a day, so we're getting city and urban information from a satellite that looks for lights. And then we're also getting weather information that's giving us the cloud formation. So it's quite a good animation that demonstrates there's all this different information that we can get from remote sensing about the environment that we have. So how do we actually get that information from these satellites, and how do we understand how forests grow? Well, ultimately, it all comes down to the properties in the vegetation itself. That's the thing that we're trying to observe when we're using remote sensing from space. If we blow up a leaf, this is a cross-section of one. And there's two types of cells in here that I try to focus for students on when we think about the link between light and the vegetation that we're looking at. And those two sets of cells are the palisade parenchyma and the spongy parenchyma. And each set of cells has a different reaction to the light that comes from the sun. I'm going to explain each of those interactions to you. This is an example of a vegetation spectrum. So this is reflective. 0 would be black, white would be 1. And this is what a leaf looks like. In fact, it's 3 leaves, 3 different eucalypt leaves. And what you can see here is the light, the reflectance, the amount of light that's coming off the leaf, reflected from the leaf surface, changes. And it changes across the spectrum. And this is actually nanometers. Don't really expect you to understand the units, but you'll have to believe me that this is the blue part of the spectrum, this is the green, and this is the red. So this demonstrates well that leaves in general are not terribly bright. Colour-wise, I mean. I'm sure they're very intelligent. Leaves themselves aren't very bright. They're quite dark colour, and there's not really too much blue light. Some green light, some red light, but in general they're pretty dark objects on the surface of the Earth. The other very incredible thing that this graph shows is look at the near-infrared part of the spectrum. So in the near-infrared part of the spectrum, we get large amounts of reflectance by vegetation. If I stepped outside on a snowy day and I looked at the trees with my near-infrared goggles on, the trees will be brighter than the snow. So that's pretty amazing. All of the light that's coming in the near-infrared part of the spectrum is reflected in the near-infrared. Whereas in the visible part of the spectrum, much more of it is being absorbed. So only a tiny, weeny little bit is being reflected. So why is that? Well, it's actually coming down to 2 things about the leaf. It's the chlorophyll in the leaf, and it's the structure of the leaf. And those 2 things are the things that allow us to understand vegetation using a remote sensing approach. Here's my spectrum again, stylized in a black line, and you can see here in the visible part of the spectrum, that's the chlorophyll absorption. In the near-infrared part of the spectrum, it's the structure of the leaf itself. The reason the way that is because chlorophyll absorbs light in the blue and in the red, and doesn't absorb light in the green. So I always think it's funny, you know, that you go to the shops at the mall and there's a wheatgrass chlorophyll shot sort of stand where you can pay your $5 and you get a shot of chlorophyll. This is what they market it as. And you know, you feel all healthy and wonderful, it's like one of those oxygen bars. So you sort of walk around and you get your little shot of chlorophyll and you move on into the hordes of the shops. And there's always this very, very vibrant green colour. And we associate chlorophyll with this very, very vibrant green colour. But I try to remind students the reason chlorophyll is green is because all the blue light and all the red light is being absorbed. That's the fundamental pigment in chlorophyll. Leaving the green isn't absorbed, so therefore it has to be reflected. So that's why chlorophyll is green. It's not because there's a fundamental pigment reaction with the green part of the spectrum, it's because the blue and the red is being absorbed. So that's why we get this green peak. That's why vegetation looks green to us. And that's why if we look at the blue and the red, we can get a really good idea of how much chlorophyll is in that vegetation. The other part of the spectrum I want to touch on is the near-infrared. Why is this so massive in the response that we get? The reason is because I think of these cells when they line up as juicy, juicy grapes. So you've got a beautiful leaf, cross-section the leaf off, and there's all these grapes all in a row, a bit like peas in a pod. And they're all juicy and supple, and there's all moisture and the leaf's all happy, and they're all lying there in a line, everything's all juicy and fantastic. And the near-infrared light comes down, and it goes, whee, bang, 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 and the near-infrared light's all bouncing around inside all the grapes, and then eventually either it bounces out, back into space, or it bounces down into the next leaf. Bang, 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 and then jumps out again. So this near-infrared light is having a great time inside the juicy grapes, and then all of that light goes back into space. So a healthy leaf giving us very large amounts of reflectance in near infrared part of vegetation. As leaves start to die, and as they become stressed, if you follow the analogy through, they become like raisins. All crinkly, no moisture, there's sort of all the structures are still there, but that intercell space isn't there as much. So when the light comes down, it can't bounce around as much. So the bouncy that we get of all of that light coming back to the satellites is really very much a function of the structure of the leaf. So I've tried to show you that two fundamental processes are available from the spectrum. There's seats around here if you want to come in this way.
Sorry.
No worries. So there's two fundamental processes that we can capture. We can capture the pigments in the leaf, and we can capture the structure of the leaf. And remote sensing is very powerful because it allows us to do both of those things when we look at the spectrum from space. So I hope you can start to see that there's a seesaw action. The more chlorophyll in the leaf, the more absorption. So it's sort of pushing it down this way. And then the more happy the leaf is in terms of its structure, the more near infrared we get in this way. It goes up. So there's a real seesawing in this line. And all of remote sensing from space, when we look at vegetation, is pretty much based on the principle of this seesawing. This ability that the more chlorophyll we get, this gets pushed down, and the more structure we get, this gets pushed up, and we get this really good sort of tangential sort of seesawing backwards and forwards, and that's really a very, very good indicator of how healthy that vegetation is. In fact, we've now used that to produce all of these indices. So many students say, oh, I've read a paper and they talk about the NDVI. That's this famous index that everyone uses when they get remote sensing imagery. The reason people use the NDVI is because it's using the near infrared and it's using the red in a simple calculation. It's simply taking the reflectance in the red minus the near infrared, the near infrared minus the red over the near infrared plus the red. It's simply a ratio that really uses this seesawing action to try to understand how vegetation is functioning itself. So this is why remote sensing is so useful. We're not just mapping bare ground, forest, water. We're not just doing land cover mapping. We're actually trying to understand how vegetation is changing itself, how the pigments are changing in the vegetation, and how the structure is changing in the vegetation. It's more than just a pretty image. And in fact, I get very cross when people say to me, oh, I just looked at a remote sensing picture. It's not a picture. It's an image of data. And that data is telling us very important things about what is happening in that vegetation. And I would, in my studies, I would look for what is the chlorophyll band saying? What is the near infrared band saying? And that really gives us this information that allows us to use this from space. So what most of the satellite programs do when they have those large global maps of gross primary production or the forest growth is they're using all of this information about the forest vegetation using the NDVI, and then they're using information on radiation, they're using information on rainfall, precipitation and temperature, and combining that to give you some sort of carbon accumulation map. And produce images that look like this. This is the satellite index. So this is exactly the physics I've just told you about, the normalized difference vegetation index. And this is combining all the temperature, all the rainfall, all the radiation to actually go away and give you an estimate of grams of carbon per meter squared per day. And this is 10 years worth of satellite data. I think it is quite incredible. It certainly shows the phenomenon, wasn't it? It certainly shows the incredible analogy of the lungs of the planet being the boreal forest. The huge uptake of carbon in the summer period as the boreal awakes, huge intake of photosynthesis and then a huge intake of carbon associated with that, and then the dieback of that vegetation in the winter months. And then a similar process happening in the south But of course, again, immediately evident that we just don't have the land mass in the south to have these huge forests that we have in the north. I also try to point out to students that Russia is an unstable country. It is a country that does not have a large protected area network. It doesn't have park managers. It doesn't have a real attempt to capture the conservation of its own forests. It is a country in turmoil. So you cannot expect that that part of the forest there is going to be always growing in that type of condition in the future. If you realize that the Russian boreal forest is essentially an unmanaged mess, then the boreal forest in Canada is incredibly important. And us putting in programs to manage and maintain the boreal forest and ensure that we have a protected network and park network in place, I think is tremendously important. And again, highlighted by this sort of world view. You can also see pretty clearly that this relationship between what the satellite is seeing for the vegetation and then linking that to carbon is pretty direct. It's not really a magic science that we do. We use we're using this fundamental information on the vegetation that we're getting from space, and really it isn't too much work to convert that into some estimate of carbon. My area of interest is the vegetation. But of course we have very similar satellites that are able to get that information on the oceans as well. And these type of mosaics where the ocean and the landmass are linked together is quite a phenomenal data set to look at. So this is sea surface temperature. It's a shame, but it just won't repeat on its own accord. Repeat on own accord. One day. So, yeah, a pretty incredible, so this is anomalies. So this is, what they would do is they would take the average sea surface temperature and for a long-term period, and then they would take the actual from that and then display that as anomalies. So blue would be cooler than normal, red would be warmer than normal. So that's the response we're seeing of El Nino and El La Nina occurring in the ocean, and then you can immediately see the impact that that then has on the terrestrial vegetation itself. So these satellite programs specialise on either the land or specialise on the oceans, but collectively you get an incredible picture of what's happening to the Earth's biosphere by linking the two together. You wouldn't have really noticed, but the beginning date of that time slice there was in the 80s. We've had remote sensing, I'll put this on while I talk. We've had remote sensing since really the early 60s was when the US in particular started launching satellites devoted to looking at the Earth. Meteorology was the prime driver, so looking at clouds and weather was really the main reason that remote sensing programs started. And believe it or not, in the early 60s, they never used to store the data. The idea was, oh, we'll just map the clouds, get a weather pattern, and we'll toss all the data away. So for quite a few years in the 60s, there's been no archive of all the satellite that we collected, because at the time, we didn't believe that collecting that data was really worthwhile. It was really only into the 70s that people started to recognize that we should be storing this. We should be storing this data in some sort of archive. And so these data sets in the old days, by the old days I mean the 70s, in the old days of the 70s, that data is in pretty poor quality. There wasn't really a recognition that that data needed to be stored and processed to the high levels that we would do that today. So in Canada, there's actually been quite an attempt to go and find that data and reprocess it. And what I've got here is a movie, and this movie is just showing us greenness of the landscape between 0 and 1, so it's a pretty even linear scale. And this is a complete reprocessing of the Canadian archive. And I think our start here is about 86. We do have images on this part of the country in the early 80s and the 70s, but again, it's pretty spotty. So our ability to derive and use these archives is really only the last 30 years, and a lot of time is being spent now trying to really use that and draw out of that the long-term trends that we see. The work that we've been doing at Fat Data at UBC is trying to look at patterns of how vegetation changes through time. So this is a graph, And on the x-axis, I've got a year. So this is a 16-day period, so this is essentially 1 full year. And then on the y-axis, I've got how much vegetation there is. You can sort of think of this as the greenness of the vegetation. And what I'm doing here is just plotting different ecoregions across Canada. So some ecoregions in Canada, through time, will have very stable amounts of greenness. These are obviously going to be evergreen type vegetation sites. They are sites that don't have a strong deciduous pulse, compared to other ecoregions which have very strong seasonal pulses. And those seasonal pulses are obviously indicative of a vegetation type that is highly deciduous, but is also, in this particular case, incredibly productive. So this is an ecoregion in Canada, highly productive, but very deciduous. So it probably falls down to a snow level in the wintertime. Whereas these more greener, more stable mines are probably far more indicative of Vancouver Island, for example, which are much more stable through time. Although it wouldn't be Vancouver Island, because it's probably a bit higher. But you can see that different ecoregions and different vegetation types would represent differently on this graph. The work we've been doing at UBC is trying to say, okay, if that's how the vegetation is changing, what does that mean for the biodiversity that lives in that vegetation? So you wouldn't have an animal that's a permanent resident. So a permanent resident is someone like me who comes into the country and then fills out about 25 pages of paperwork and then sends $1,500 and it takes 2.5 years. No. A permanent resident would be an animal that lives in the ground or on the ground, like a bird. A bird would be a permanent resident. Some species would actually live in that particular home range all the time, versus a species that's more migratory, which would actually move in response to the environment. So there are very few species that would actually stay living in an environment that was so dynamic as this. It's unlikely that you would get many permanent residents in that type of environment. Whereas if you have a highly productive long-term throughout the whole year, then maybe that's an environment that sustains more permanent residents within its particular ecoregion. So we can sort of use this and try to understand from this what type of animals might live where. We've developed this index, and this index uses the minimum value, the integrated value, and the covariance. So the minimum value provides us an indication of how low does the greenness get. Does it go to snow, or do you end up with a shrub base, or do you end up with forest all year round? What is the lowest level that you can expect? What is the up and down variation that you can expect, which gives you an idea of whether you're dealing with a deciduous ecosystem or an evergreen ecosystem? And then what is the productivity, the overall productivity? So the Arctic would be highly seasonal, but very low, because not particularly productive. Whereas perhaps the Appalachian, the mixed wood forests would be quite dynamic, but highly productive. Lots of area under the curve, lots of greenness. So we've been trying to use these indices that we extract to go away and make maps. So this is all of Canada. This is using a satellite that gives us a 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre pixel. And you can see here I can display the minimum, the integrated productivity, and the seasonal, and come back with this fairly stunning, in my view, looking image, which we think provides an indication of what the habitat conditions are like for biodiversity across the country. So this isn't predicting how many birds there will be, rather it's giving us an idea of the terrestrial vegetation. We can understand the pattern of the terrestrial vegetation. These colours would mean something. Red would be highly seasonal, not very productive, very low levels of minimum cover. Whereas in Vancouver Island, much more stable, not as much seasonality, highly productive. So you can see that we can sort of pull these different parts out by using this type of index. We've been spending time looking at how that's changing across Canada. So this is 25 years worth of this DHI, this habitat index, the greenness, the seasonality, and the minimum cover. And we can see here pixels that are highlighted that have had significant change over that period. So we can try to characterise the biodiversity and then see whether we think that environment has changed significantly over that 25-year time. We can see some highlights here, the large amount of increase in greenness associated with the northern part of Quebec, which has been documented by quite a few other research groups looking at greenness from space. Changes in the prairie areas here through the US and up into Alberta. Changes in, we think that's associated with changes in cropping and changes in patterning of the crops, which is causing the seasonality to be changing. And then changes in American harvesting patterns in the Pacific Northwest has actually resulted in increases in productivity, also quite well documented in places like Oregon. So we can sort of use this satellite data, get an idea of this habitat association, and then look at that relationship through time. We've been trying to relate that to certain animals. We've done work in the Ontario Breeding Bird Survey. So this is where the birds are observed throughout Ontario in their breeding bird atlas. We use information from space on the habitat. We also use information on terrain, climate, and land cover, and then go away and make predictions of what we believe the grassland population will be based on the remote sensing data we see of land cover and productivity. Our most recent work of this is trying to look at this into the future. So this is a similar sort of idea as Sally Aitken and Tom Lee and Andreas Harmon have done by looking at how do our current associations of vegetation change into the future. And whereas they've been mapping them as Beck zones, we've been trying to do a similar thing but using the habitat index. So here's the same image blowing up for British Columbia. We're seeing these again, the same sort of patterns occurring, so these highly seasonal alpine environments that would have changes in snow are appearing very red. A very high bluey greeny colour is highly productive. We would have then here fairly productive but not as seasonal in this particular case. We can see these sort of spatial patterns that we can see. We've been linking this to the climate and then through regression trees and then looking at how we believe this is going to change through time. So this is a 2080 prediction of what we think the greenness will look like based on a B1, A1 and A2 climate scenario, which would then produce this change in what we expect the environment will look like under these three different climate scenarios. Is it getting too dark? I can do that perhaps. So it gives you an idea of how we believe that environment is changing. We believe this type of technique complements the Beck zone technique because we can try to relate these different things to what we believe the habitat conditions will be. So we're trying to go after thinking, well, what sort of animal changes are going to be occurring? If the seasonality part of the ecosystem is moving north or it's changing, what are the implications for animals that would require that seasonality as part of their habitat? There are some pretty ones. This is the DHR at the present time, changing through the different scenarios. This is work of Keith Holmes, who's a master's student of mine who's based in UVic. He's got a great website that I can point you to where he has movies that you can flick through these through time. So I think that gives you an idea of the very broad work that we're doing, sort of looking at Canada as a whole and the Earth as a whole to some extent using remote sensing technology. I agree with Suzanne so much, and TerreWEB in general, about this idea of getting science out. This is an app. It was only released about 2 weeks ago. It's a NASA app that you can get for your iPhone or your iPad. It's called Earth Now, and it has vital signs. You click on vital signs, and it gives you like a doctor's report, and it gives you ozone, CO2, sea surface temperature, carbon, terrestrial NPP, and it gives you a little list, and you click on what you want, and it will pull in the latest NASA image of that particular thing. So this isn't like, this is their ad, which is 2007, December 7, 2011, but this will give it to you for this week. And it will download all that data, make it into an image and put it onto your app, and you can spin the Earth around and move it around. You zoom in, it starts to look pretty crappy because it's not perfect data, but it is an example of this I think this change in perception that we've got to get the data quickly to the public. Historically, remote sensing, the imagery was collected a year ago, or 6 months ago, or 5 years ago. There's very much a recognition that if we're going to start to deliver this data, we've got to start to do it in close to real time. And that's what these types of apps do in their delivery of that type of data. The fact that this works on smartphones leads me very nicely into a bit of a discussion about some of the work that we're doing around citizen science and using smartphones to gather and collect information. This has become a very hot topic, this idea of citizen science. You could call it crowdsourcing, you could call it participatory science. It's where the recognition is that people themselves could collect data for the science that we do. People can be an integrative part of the collection of the data and the analysis of that data if we want. They say that some of the very early stuff of this was based on computer networking. So they recognized very early that the large workstations weren't enough, and they would start to send data out to people's workstations that they would work on, and then be automatically sent back. And I remember in the 80s there was the SETI project, which was where it was these huge scanned atmospheric astronomical images, and they were sent back to your home computer, and your home computer worked whenever your computer was idle. You tried to find a result, and it came back. It got sent back to the server. Nowadays, there's like 50 of those. There's still the SETI ones. We're still looking for extraterrestrials. But the Human Genome Project, a number of those genome sequencing projects are all using that type of approach, where people can sign in, log in, set up an account, and when their computer is idle, it does some processing and sends the result back to the main mainframe. And that has that flavour of idea has grown and really has now led perhaps into this citizen science idea. The people really leading the citizen science work are bird people. They are very passionate and very keen about the birds that they see, and have collected logs and logs and logs of the birds they see. So the eBird data set is one that's very, very commonly used as a demonstration of how powerful citizen science can be. I do have a slide on that, but I did want to show you this one first. I talked about this at the soil seminar as well. When remote sensing was first launched and satellites were launched, we only ever thought that the daytime was worth seeing anything. And so most satellites don't record data at night. So it takes about 90 minutes for the satellite to go around the Earth. For 45 minutes they're on, and for the other 45 minutes they're still on, but they don't save the data and they don't send it back to Earth. Because there was a perception that there was nothing really interesting to see. The military launched a satellite that was designed to start to look at lights in cities. And it was classified for many, many, many years, but recently, perhaps in the last 10 years or so, they've completely opened up the archive. And so this satellite is called DMSP, Digital Meteorological Satellite Program. There's been quite a number of them. And this is the image that comes from it. And we see this image so much now. You often see it as posters, and you often see it as even TV ads. I've seen them use this image. And it belittles it by seeing it on a TV ad. It is a remarkable image. This is collected over a period of time, about a year, because there's so many clouds and it's difficult to get a true lock on the light, because the lights are very faint from a distance of a satellite. So these are built up over a period of time. You can imagine we have cruise ships and we have gas-burning oil platforms that are all removed from the process. And really, after a great deal of filtering, we end up with an image that looks like this. Quite a phenomenal representation of where the people are and the energy that people are using, which I think is the incredible thing, because you look at this and you say, oh, that's about right, but then you say, well, where's Indonesia? Or where is, why is India with so many more people, or China for that matter, why isn't it so much more bright? So it's an interesting image to compare, essentially it's an energy use and an availability of energy map, more than it is just lights. And I think it's quite a remarkable image to compare with where we expect our people to be, to really give us an idea of what our impact is from space. I guess the other thing that hits me from this is that people always say the only thing you can see from the moon is the Great Wall of China. That annoys me in both respects. Firstly, you can't see the Great Wall of China because the Great Wall of China is too long and thin to see from the moon. But there are so many human impacts on the Earth that you can see from satellite, and so many impacts you can see from the moon. So, it's silly to say that's the only effect we have. When you look at something like this, you just realise that the massive scale of human development of the Earth that we can observe by satellites. This is a fantastic image. This is the image of friends on Facebook. So this is all the Facebook links of everyone's friends. And Facebook did this and then plotted the link between friends in Facebook and made it a line. So big fat lines are where lots of friends meet, and then big dots will be where cities have lots and lots of links. And I think it's quite a phenomenal comparison comparing people and people's networks and how people communicate with the lights and the energy that we use from the Earth. I think it's a remarkable thing to compare. Of course, it also compares well to cell phone usage, which is what I'm moving to of my eBird and my cell phones. Citizen science is all about collecting information. And the best way to collect information these days is really pretty much through our cell phones. This is cell phone logs from a group that is based in Europe that was doing analysis around cell phones. So they were using cell phone logs of the iPhone. This is a movie of theirs called Firefly. And it is about 6 months, I believe, of iPhone usage in Europe. Truly beautiful. And you can see that the movement of people, obviously the hot spots of where most of the iPhone users are in Europe, and then the movement of those phones and the people as they move around through the communication through Europe. Visually stunning, but also I think incredibly interesting in terms of where the people are, where they're using, and the capacity of people to collect information and use that as part of the science that we have. To have all of these people traveling around with devices that can measure and data, we should try to harness this and use it. This was all prior to that bit of kerfuffle about iPhone and data and iPhone always knowing where you are. So now this isn't collected automatically anymore, and you have to sign up and join this group. So if you're powerfully impacted by this beautiful video, go to proudflow.net, you can log in, and then you can send your iPhone logs automatically to them. Colin Furster, who's a PhD student in my lab, is really doing work around how can we use this in a remote sensing context. And he put this great slide together that I think demonstrates that an iPhone is a lot more than just a phone. Obviously, we can store data, we can network and transfer that data over the network very quickly. We can enter a variety of different pieces of information. We can touch it, we can keypad it. It has a camera, it has a microphone, it's got a GPS, it's got a compass, and it can tell where we are in this type of thing using a gyrometer and an accelerator. It can tell the iPhone can pick up all of that. So it's a remarkable device that's collecting a great deal of information wherever we go. So, as I mentioned, the eBird people are some of the most crazy people who have sort of taken this and pushed it to its logical extent. There's an eBird app that you can download that shows you all the recent birds that have been seen within Vancouver in the last week. You can go to a location and say, give me all the birds that were here in the last day, and it gives you a great deal of information about those birds and where they occur. They've been using this to produce maps like this. This is 1.5 million observations of birds that's then displayed throughout a whole season. And you can get an extraordinary level of detail by just having all of these observations provided to these central servers and then gone away and modeled it. You can see this is for two particular species, a yellow throat and a sparrow, but they can do this for any of the species in the database. This was impossible 5 years ago. So it's quite a remarkable technology by allowing people to collect data and then providing that back to do some sort of analysis. It's a remarkable tool that we can start to harness. Colin's work is focusing on fire. So in remote sensing, fire, especially in the Okanagan and Australia and places where fire is a very serious issue, is fuel loads about fire is very hard to get from remote sensing because it's often the lower parts of the forest canopy, and we're always looking from above. So trying to understand fuel loads and how fuel loads are changing through time is very difficult to do directly from remote sensing. So Colin's app is very much based on tools that people can use to go away and record the fuel loads in their particular location. The way we do that is use a basic photo guide that's very commonly used. This is the one that we have for British Columbia. And as a hard copy, what it is pictures of different forest stands with a key, essentially. So you look at the picture, oh yeah, my forest looks a bit like that, yes, that's about right, line it all up, and then you get a table that tells you what your fuel load would be in a forest that looks like that. This obviously lends itself very well to being put in an app. So in the app, you can actually pick what part of a forest stand you're looking at. You can record that information by saying, yes, it's a 3, yes, it's a 4, yes, it's a 5. We can also get detailed information on the woody debris, so you can flick through the different panels that tell you how much woody debris there would be, allows you to set that in. And you can also collect the overstory information as well, make calculations with the height. You can take a photograph, so Colin allows you to take a picture up this way, down, picture up, so we get a hemispherical type view, look at the top of the forest canopy. And then this is summarised and automatically sent to us back at UBC. So if they're walking around the forest and there's no phone coverage, it will just store the data on the iPhone, and then when they come into phone coverage, or if you choose to do it through the network, all of this data is then sent back to UBC and we can add that to our database. The idea being that we can start to fill these types of areas with more and more and more and more point locations to try to understand what is the pattern of that fuel load across the landscape. We ultimately want to use that to improve our models of fuel load in the forests. But as Colin has been doing his work, we've also began to realise that there are many other questions in citizen science that need to be asked as well. What happens if someone maliciously starts to use that? What if they only go to places that they think where fuel reduction loading should be done? What if the samples no longer become random? What if people start to put bad data into the system and start to submit that? Issues around making sure that we stratify the people. We're only going to get data along tracks. How do you deal with that when all the data that you're getting from citizens is biased in terms of the spatial location? And then how do you encourage citizens to be involved? And then how do you reward them and keep them informed through the process? And a lot of work on citizen science says the worst thing you can do, of course, is get the public really excited and then never hear from them again. So how do you build in a process that allows them to be active members, but also feel as though they've got active interest and a vested interest in the outcome? So Colin's thesis has become 2-part remote sensing, 2-part public perception, working with citizens, working with groups, looking at the literature and trying to work out the best way that we can try to use this citizen science in the remote sensing work that we do. Apps are very exciting. I just want to show you something that undergraduates can do as well. I don't know how many of you know about this Sustainability 101 course that we've been running this semester, but some students built an app for it. The app was given to all of the undergraduate students in the class, and they had to learn about different systems on campus. The food system, the solid waste system, the energy system, and the water system. And we had it set up so they walked around, and when they got close to where they were supposed to go, they could type into the thing that they were close, would check their GPS location, where they are as to where they were supposed to be, and then once they got to the right place, a series of questions then came up. They had to answer the questions right, and then they were given the clues to the next one. And we had them walking around the power lines and the energy, the power plant, and went to UBC Farm. And it was a great way of interacting and bringing people together using these types of apps and involving the public in that process. The last bit of technology I want to talk about that is fantastic and also relates well to some of the work we're doing in terms of our public outreach is LiDAR. So LiDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. It is similar to radar in concept. We send a pulse of light out, and we wait till that pulse comes back, and we record how long that takes. So this is a bit of a NASA graphic. LiDAR actually isn't in space, but this is the space version of what it would be like if it was. You can see it sends the pulse down to the ground, and it counts the time. So that second that I was talking about there, it's counting the time for that pulse to come back. And if you plot the time it takes to come back, you essentially are getting the pattern of the landscape beneath the satellite as it passes over. This is a little bit misleading because the pulses of light are sent at the speed of light. The speed of light is very, 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 very fast. So when it actually sends those pulses down, it sends about 200,000 pulses per second. So this graph implies that it's like pulse, pulse, pulse. These satellites send out about 200,000, satellites or aeroplanes send out 200,000 pulses per second, allowing us to build up this incredibly detailed pattern of the landscape. This is what would happen in a forest environment. Down comes the laser pulse, and by our interaction, as we pass through that forest canopy, we can get a great deal of structural information about where the structure of the forest actually is. So it provides fantastic information in a forest because we can get our canopy height information and our ground, but it also can provide very good detail in an urban environment as well, because the LiDAR data gives us extremely detailed information about the surface and then the heights of the buildings upon it. So to demonstrate that, this is just an ortho photograph, a standard picture of what a city would look like. We can fly that with LiDAR and automatically extract every building and then automatically extract every tree. Every tree we have the height, we've got the amount of foliage, and in every building we have all this detailed information about the building footprint. It's extremely detailed. This is of Vancouver. It's near, we call it the Sunset site, so it's near 40 Kennedy and 41st, I think, is near the intersection that it's at. This is Rory Coops' work, who's a PhD student in my lab. He's coloured this nicely. It's actually coloured by height. But you can also see you're getting a response of deciduous versus evergreen vegetation there. But every single house here, we're getting very detailed information about the structure of that building, its roofs, its size, and all that sort of information. We then automatically extract that. So we write computer algorithms, and those computer algorithms will go away and model every single building explicitly that we've captured as we've flown it over with LiDAR. So, why do that? Well, I hope you can see that if we have a very detailed model of what the city actually looks like, we can then look at radiation passing over that city from the sun through time. So for a certain day, for certain atmospheric conditions, clouds or diffuse light or direct light, we can go away and model what we believe the interception of the radiation is for any position within that solar surface. So you can imagine essentially the computer algorithm, you have a pixel. A pixel might be a meter by a meter, and what it's doing is it's mapping the movement of the sun throughout the day to give you the direct radiation. And then you can do a sky view factor, how much of the sky is blocked, how much of the sky is open. This will actually give you your estimate of the diffuse radiation. So we build these urban models, and then for every pixel we can calculate, okay, the sun's going over this day, where is the sun, where is it going over, and then we can get the direct, and then the diffuse radiation as an estimate. The reason this is useful is because it allows us to work out the potential of those environments for solar panels. So this is a picture in North Vancouver, an aerial photograph. This is actually a school. You can see the school here and some streets and some roads and some houses, the forest. You can see here the same environment that we've captured from LiDAR. So we've flown that with LiDAR. We've then built every building using our computer algorithms, and then we've modeled the sun throughout the whole year. And we can see here the radiation that's intercepted by these surfaces based on these types of models. You can clearly see a really unique part of this work is that you can immediately see the impacts of the vegetation. So very open, clear roofs that are very flat, have very high radiation interception. So do roofs that are facing particular ways, south, for example. But in the northern facing slopes of roofs that are like that, pointing towards the north, we can see this reduction in radiation, of course, because of the sun and where the sun is in relation to the house. We've been doing this work for a while and then started to work with the District of North Vancouver. So the District of North Vancouver has a lot of LiDAR data that they've flown of their own district. And so what we've been doing is working with the district to make an online GIS sort of tool that people can go away and click on their own individual house. So if you wanted to find this, you can. It's open to the public. It's called TerreWEB. So if you just Google TerreWEB and District of North Vancouver, you would come to this sort of GIS website. And if you go into the website, it says launch. If you launch into the website, there's a solar app. This is the solar app here. You can, it's based on like a Google Map type influence, so you can stick your cursor down and move around, look at any individual house, and then what we have here is we've gridded the data to 1 meter by 1 meter. So these are 1 meter cells. Every house is made up of a variety of 1 meter cells. And then we make a radiation calculation of what we think the load, the interception would be of that particular cell throughout the whole year. We've got a bit of a tool, so you can go and click on your own house and averages all of the cells that occur within the boundary of your house. We come back and give a bit of assessment for how good of a target we think your house will be for solar panels, and we provide some basic information as to what we think the radiation interception of your particular roof would be throughout the whole year, seasonally. And there's a bit of a tool that we developed with the province. The province has got a solar awareness campaign. So they've got basic equations we can use about how much the solar cells cost and what the infrastructure would be, what the installation cost would be. So you can do some basic calculations of, okay, I've got 2 people in my house and my hot water system is principally gas, so therefore you would get this much in a solar saving in a year and X amount of CO2 savings. You can see here I've clicked on a very nice little cul-de-sac. I've never been there myself, Wembley Place. Nice little cul-de-sac here, and you can see houses here. Again, very, very strong potential on the front of their roofs. At the back, on the north side, much, much lower amounts. Houses here, for example, with large amounts of tree cover, as we would expect, a much less capacity to intercept the solar radiation than houses that have a much more clearer sort of overview. So this has been a tool that we developed to try to make this data and these results more accessible. And it's been very successful in terms of District of North Vancouver. We've certainly been very active with them promoting it and talking about it. They see it, I think, pretty much as a demonstration of how useful the technology could be. I don't know, they are very keen to see residents use it, but I don't think the sole purpose is just for one person to click and get their house. Rather, I think it's just trying to demonstrate to the residents the power of the technology, or the ability of the technology, and increase the awareness, I guess, of what the potential would be should different people wish to try to use it. I'll just close down my backup window. Yeah, there's the tools in a bit more detail. Again, I'm happy to show you where the website is, and you can play around and do to different houses. And if you live in a district of North Vancouver, you can find your own house. So, I hope I've given you a flavour of the work we're doing around forests and vegetation and how we look at that in a changing environment. I've tried to give you some of the structure of why remote sensing works so well. There is a fundamental basis to why vegetation is useful, why remote sensing is useful. It's more than just pretty pictures. And so when you do think about the images that you see, remind yourselves that there is an underlying physics in there that's actually telling you about the vegetation that you're seeing. And that explains why these large global coverages are playing such an important role in terms of the past environment, the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and how it's changing. I think applications like this are a great way of demonstrating at a global level how the Earth is changing, but whether this actually instills behaviour change, I'm not really sure. I doubt it, because it's so global. It's difficult for people to sort of see their individual capacity to change within that type of environment. But I do think that the increasing use of citizen science and getting people involved is one way that we can do that. And I think Colin's work with the app and Rory's work with his linking with the District of North Vancouver are both quite different ways that we can use remote sensing data and then make it more accessible to the people the people who are going to go away and use that data. I did say I would talk about how sustainable is remote sensing, because I think that's an interesting question. Remote sensing is inherently nationalistic, as I mentioned. Different countries launch their own satellites. And there is some concern that that's just going to continue. That the Indians, Pakistanis, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Australians, the Canadians, the Americans are all going to keep launching satellites, and many of these satellites are exactly the same. So I've explained to you why nations might think that's important. But the European Space Agency and NASA have both got a study out that's looking at what is the exactly the life cycle of these rockets and the impact that they're having in terms of the CO2 emissions when we launch these rockets into space. And then this idea of how can we build satellites that are collectively owned? And how can we start to ensure that these satellite programs are launched in a way that stops duplication. Because there's no doubt that it's an enormously expensive science, and everyone doing exactly the same thing by launching exactly the same satellites is really difficult. So I hope you found it interesting. I've mentioned most of the people I want to acknowledge. Laura and Colin, of course, Fabio did all the processing of that satellite data of Canada. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you very much.